Why does my vagina feel like it's about to fall out? This is actually a really popular Google search. And so you're not alone. I want you to know that. Also, don't forget to hit my subscribe button so you don't miss any of my new videos. We're going to talk a little bit about what prolapse is. Maybe you've heard of prolapse and maybe you haven't heard of prolapse. Prolapse is when, if we're going to look at a few pictures here, so this is your normal anatomy. This is looking at somebody from the side. This is the front of your pubic bone here. Here's your tailbone at the back. Here is your 3D pelvis here. There is looking into your pelvis. So all that red you see there in the bottom is your pelvic floor muscle. Or if we look this way, there it is making up that bowl in the back. And so on this picture here, this blue I've drawn is your pelvic floor muscle in the bottom. Here's your bladder. This is your uterus. This is your vaginal canal. Your vagina is here. And then here is your rectum. So this is kind of normal anatomy. A prolapse can happen with three different things. It can happen with your bladder, it can happen with your uterus, or it can happen with your rectum. Your bladder tends to be the most common. This is an example here of a bladder prolapse, or what they also call a cystocele. And so you can see here, it's where the walls of your bladder start to fall into the walls of the vaginal canal. You can have varying degrees of this. A minor prolapse is where the walls of the bladder are just falling into the vaginal canal. A more moderate is when it's falling towards and is typically visible at the opening. And a severe, usually you know when you have one of these, is where it's starting to actually protrude out of the opening of the vagina. And so there you can see, right, how much pressure your bladder is now putting down on your pelvic floor. So it's really pushing down. If we look into this bowl of muscles again, it's really pushing down into that bowl of muscles, and typically sometimes gives us that sensation that something wants to fall out of there. It can be sort of an achy feeling, an uncomfortable feeling. We feel like there's a tennis ball there, or we just feel like things are going to fall right out. This next picture is an example where your uterus, so see where your uterus sits up top here, your uterus is now falling down into the vaginal canal. And again, see this being more severe case where it's putting pressure down on your pelvic floor. So that uterus is falling down, sitting on top of your pelvic floor, and typically makes us feel like something wants to fall out of there. And then lastly here, this picture is showing where your rectum, the walls of your rectum are actually, again, now pushing down into the walls of the vaginal canal, into your perineum area. And again, can give us that exact sensation, exact same sensation that something wants to fall out of there. Check out my other previous video that talks about 3 different ways that you can check out on yourself to see if you have prolapse as well. Now, who gets prolapse? So typically it's very, very common post-menopause, and that instance grows higher and higher and higher as we age, as we get farther away from that day of menopause. Your day of menopause is the day where it's been a year since your last period, and then after that day where it's been more than a year, you start to be in that post-menopause phase. So typically in that 60 to 80 years plus is when prolapse gets quite common. Post-hysterectomy, so sometimes when they take out your uterus, your organs now have more room to shift around, and so sometimes they end up shifting into the wrong place. So often after a hysterectomy where your uterus has been removed, your bladder sometimes typically wants to fall out of place, and that typically ends up being right into the vaginal canal. And then postpartum, and unfortunately approximately 50% of women who have had a vaginal birth will have some degree of prolapse postpartum. Now, the good news on that is that only about 7% of those women will have symptoms from it. So while it's very common, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a problem for you. So risk factors for getting prolapse: a vaginal birth, and then also bigger babies, and then also subsequent vaginal birth. So someone that's had 4 vaginal births is going to be more likely to suffer from prolapse versus someone that's had 1 vaginal birth. Someone that had a 5-pound baby is going to be a little less likely to have a prolapse than someone who had a 10-pound baby. Pressure. So lots of pressure going down into the pelvic floor. Things like people that have a chronic cough, right? We're coughing, and if you feel yourself cough, you can feel some of that pressure going down into the bottom of your pelvis. Constipation. So we're constantly bearing down and putting down extra pressure through that area. And then also obesity. So we just have more weight and more pressure going down. Those things will make you more at risk for prolapse. Hormones. So when we have lower levels of estrogen, typically that will happen after menopause. That can also happen in our postpartum period. And there are other conditions where your hormones might get a little bit out of whack, and often that lower level of estrogen affects our tissues. That effect on our tissues makes them less strong, and that also will sometimes cause things to want to fall and bulge down into them, and then the vaginal walls won't be as strong at holding them back. Aging unfortunately. And I think the statistic went up to almost 70% of women over the age of 70 will have some degree of prolapse. Again, not everybody will have symptoms from it, so it doesn't necessarily always need to be an issue, but that is something that is there. And then a family history. Research shows that if you have a family history of prolapse, your mother, your grandmother, your aunts, you could be more likely to suffer from prolapse yourself. That often has to do with your tissue integrity. So some people have more hypermobile tissue. That itself is hereditary, and that will also cause or make you more likely for prolapse. So now what? Check out some of my other videos on prolapse. The best line of treatment is going to be pelvic floor exercises. That is superior over surgery, over pessaries, over anything else. The success rate for doing pelvic floor exercises, the right pelvic floor exercises, is actually very high for eliminating your symptoms of prolapse. We need to make sure that that pelvic floor contracts properly, relaxes properly, and is strong as you move and lift and cough and sneeze and go through life. Check out my absolutely free webinar where we're going to talk exactly about what prolapse is, what you need to be doing about it, and then also my secret ingredient for the correct exercises in terms of getting that prolapse better and getting rid of your symptoms. I included the link below, and then feel free also to check out some of my other prolapse videos.